Canada's emission standards. How do they work? Can they be improved? Somewhere in the Albertan wilderness.
Emission standards have long been used by the provincial governments of Canada to manage air emissions, as they ensure that emission reductions are achieved at appropriate levels in industrial facilities. Emission standards prescribe a specific limit of the amount of pollutant that can be released into the natural environment. It is important to ensure that all facilities meet some minimum level of air pollution standard regardless of the air quality of the region, as many pollutants can have significant effects on human health directly in the vicinity of industrial facilities, such as volatile organic compounds. There are many industrial facilities throughout Canada that release nitric oxide, or NOx, and sulfur dioxide, or SO2, that once mixed into the atmosphere can undergo reactions with oxygen and water vapor to create nitric acid and sulfuric acid respectively. These byproducts of industrial emissions precipitate from the atmosphere as acid rain and cause damaging effects to ecosystems, such as elevating pH levels in lakes and reducing species diversity. This is just one example of how emissions can become hazardous if left uncontrolled. So how does the Canadian government ensure these emission levels are kept below the emission standard? Well, emission standards require regulated parties to install control systems that can continuously monitor emissions from industrial stacks. The Alberta government regulates air emissions from industrial sources through setting standards based on baseline ambient air quality and guidelines, source emission standards based on the nature of the air contaminant, the process industry, and the best available air pollution technology, and results of air dispersing modeling, which takes into the account the local meteorology, terrain, and surrounding emission source. Professional air quality companies are then hired by industries to perform regulatory compliance source emission tests to further ensure that industrial pollution that is released into the air is kept at appropriate levels. They must follow Environment Canada's guidelines for emission testing in order for their procedures to have warranted results.
Method 7A is used for the determination of NOx emissions, including nitric oxide and nitrogen dioxide from stationary sources such as NOx emission stacks. This method involves collecting a sample in an evacuated flask containing a dilute sulfuric acid hydrogen peroxide absorbing solution. The NOx is oxidized to nitrate and measured by ion chromatography. Ion chromatography is a process that allows the separation of ions and polar molecules based on their affinity to the ion exchanger. Method 6 is used for the determination of SO2 emissions from stationary sources as well. This involves the extraction of a gas sample from the sampling point of the emission stack. The SO2 and the sulfur trioxide are then separated, and the SO2 fraction is measured by the barium-thorium titration method. Both of these methods allow for emissions testers to create measurable data that show the parts per million of the pollutant being released through emissions, and if it is above or below the appropriate level. Several systems used to improve the regulation of emissions in the atmosphere have already been implemented in various parts of the world. These are some Canada could potentially use. Emissions trading programs are economic instruments that can be used to manage industrial air emissions by pricing air pollution. There are two different versions. The cap and trade system. In this system, the total volume of allowable emissions from all regulated parties is established by the government. The government then makes available a total number of permits equal to this cap. These permits are either allocated to facilities for free or auctioned off to emitters. At the end of each compliance period, usually a year, each facility must remit to the government one permit for each unit of emissions emitted by that facility in that year. If emissions permits are allocated for free, facilities with low abatement costs may reduce their emissions below the allocated permit levels and then sell any excess permits to those emitters that face high emissions abatement costs. If the permits are auctioned off, emitters must pursue on-site reductions available at costs lower than the auction price and can purchase from the auction the remaining permits necessary to cover their emissions. In the baseline and credit system, each regulated party is assigned a baseline, which is representative of its allowable emissions intensity. If the emissions intensity is below its baseline, it generates credits. If the regulated party's emissions are above its baseline, it must then purchase the required number of credits to ensure compliance. The required credits are calculated by the difference between the baseline intensity and the actual emissions intensity multiplied by the facility's production in that year.
The implementation of an emissions charge system could also be used to regulate emissions. Emission charges are a payment or fee that is based on the quantity of pollutants that are released into the environment. Based on the value of the emissions charge, regulated parties could self-determine if it is more cost-effective to pay the emissions charge, install abatement control technologies, or decrease their output to reduce their emissions and thus avoid the charge. Emissions charges should be set slightly above the marginal cost of abatement to achieve the desired emissions reduction, in order to encourage those with marginal costs of abatement below the rate to reduce emissions and those with higher costs to pay the charge. Determining the appropriate means of calculating the charge is another critical system design feature. NOx charges will need to be imposed on emissions rather than on fuel, as NOx formation is virtually independent of the nitrogen content of fuels. Unlike NOx emissions, some SO2 emissions are directly related to the sulfur content of fuels. As a result, for SO2 emissions caused by combustion, charges would be levied either on the sulfur content of the fuels or emissions. However, some industrial processes emit SO2 emissions unrelated to fuel combustion, so an emissions-based charge may be necessary. Some advantages of this system would be internalizing costs. Polluters face a price on all emissions released, thereby internalizing the cost of their pollution. Flexibility. Regulated entities can choose the most effective means to reduce emissions, thereby providing flexibility in compliance. Cost effectiveness. By providing flexibility, emitters can seek out the most cost-effective means to achieve emissions reductions, thereby providing an economically efficient means of achieving an environmental outcome. Price certainty. Emissions prices set by the government will provide regulated entities with a degree of certainty over compliance costs. And simplicity. Emissions charges will be relatively simple to design and implement. Thank you for watching.